Welcome to Make It Plain from Make Plain Jesus Ministries, featuring Pastor James Bryan, where we take biblical truths in everyday situations and break them down to be as plain as possible. So, stay tuned and enjoy the broadcast.
Well, welcome once again to the latest episode of Make It Plain. And so I'm your host, James Bryan, and I just want to begin to share some just common or ordinary things that we all face or think about or have to deal with on a regular basis, but I add a biblical perspective to it. And so as we spend this time together, my hope is that everything that we talk about would give you food for thought and that it would impact you in some way, shape, or form and that you can use it. We've had this privilege over the past year or so that we've been able to share with you just some relevant topics ranging from all types of situations that we face. Some of them may have been purely biblical. Many of them were just questions about what's going on in society. How do you deal with all the other things that are happening? And so right now we find ourselves in a new year called 2021. And I know a lot of folks thought that things would be magically different once we went from December 31st to January 1st. And the truth is, things are still progressing, meaning that there are still a lot of things happening, both in the news, in the communities, and in relationships. And as we spend this little bit of time together, I thought it would be appropriate for us to just share about this topic of the art of conversation. The art of conversation. You see, many of you may not realize that it takes skill at times to really have a good conversation. It takes skills and it's a purposeful event when you're having conversations that are productive with folks, because everybody has a different personality and everybody has a different motive and everyone has a different point of view. The art of this whole conversation that we have is to be able to reach people who are coming from different points of view and understand one another. It may be that at times you never agree, but you're able to respect each other. And that, at a minimum, we should all have. I don't know how many of you who are listening have been around children, but when you look at children and you see them interacting, you'll see some that get along really well because they have the same interest. But then you'll see some that are different or not as familiar with the other group of children that may have a difficult time interacting. And depending on how well or how interested the group is to bring in someone in new or to have them take part, depends on how well that relationship goes. I've seen at times where children have just welcomed in some others and they just said, let's play, let's do some things. And what do you want to do? And then they begin to find something they can do together. But I've also seen situations where children will cross their arms. Well, I don't know this one. I don't like this one. And so a conversation never takes place. And so, you may think that that's true and you see that with children on a regular basis. But the funny thing is that even as the children grow out to be adults, you see the same type of scenarios or situations occurring. And so really, we're talking about the art of having a conversation. Now, just for laughs, I went ahead into Google search and I was just curious, if I searched for having a civil conversation or having a conversation and just did some searches there, I know to your surprise that there was no shortage of results and people speaking on those topics and websites and things like that. Just on one of those searches, I had over 5 million results. 5 million. And you could think about it as that's a very popular topic that people are searching for, trying to understand or give their opinion about how conversations should go forward. And so when we think about it, we live in a world where there's more than one person existing, meaning that There are countless people. There are billions of people on the planet. That means that you're never an island to yourself. So you have to be able to interact with others. So the question becomes, well, how do you do that regularly? Isn't it just speaking? Well, on the surface, I would say yes, but it's much more than that, right? Think about the interactions you've had. Maybe you've gone to a different city. Maybe you've gone to a different country. They may be speaking the same words, but the way the accents are set up or the body language around the different words may be different. And a word that may mean one thing in your community may mean something totally different when you go to another community. So herein, we have this issue about the art of communication. How do you communicate so you both can understand one another and what the true motives and the intent are? So it really is an art to think about it and to think about, well, how do I speak to other people? In this political world in which we live, there are so many different opinions, and unfortunately, there are large gaps in between each opinion. And so the question is, how do you have a civil conversation? Most of the conversations that you see, they really aren't conversations, they're shouting matches. Even if you're looking on social media at a conversation, they're really shouting matches. And so nothing is being received. It's only you listen to me only and not I listen to what you say also. So how do you change that and how do you go forward with that? I would tell you there are many people, as I told you, over 5 million results. There are many people who have different opinions on how to do that. And so I just want to give you some high level thoughts from there. And there are people that are experts in this field. But I just want to give you some practical things to think about when you're having conversations. And so, first of all, let's think about this. Conversations happen in many different areas or arenas. What I mean by that, you could have conversations within your family household. And sometimes that doesn't always go well, right? You could have conversations in your church. And depending on your viewpoints, that may or may not go well. You could have conversations at your job. And depending on what's going on, that may or may not go well. And how you communicate is very different. When one communicates with a police officer after they pulled them over for speeding, the conversation needs to be of a certain way, right? If someone is really just trying to have a conversation when they're interviewing for a job, that conversation has to be of a certain structure. And these are things we have to think about when we're having our conversations. So let me give you these points that I want to share with you, just to give you some thoughts there. First of all, I want you to remember that a conversation is just that. It's not a shouting match. A conversation is an engagement where you're communicating. One is communicating a thought. The other is communicating also a thought, maybe in response to what was communicated to them. So in other words, you're supposed to speak and listen, not just speak. And so it goes back and forth. So a conversation is something where there is some listening that occurs. And so we have to understand that when we want to engage in someone or in a conversation with someone, that we also have to listen to their responses and what they're saying and their viewpoints. I've spoken to many people from different political backgrounds, and that's the fun of the whole thing, is that you get to hear people's differing viewpoints. But each of them say, even from their own angle or their own viewpoints, it's like, I can't understand why that group thinks that way. And I tried to listen, but I couldn't. The fact is, when I've listened to them, they really haven't listened. They've only given their viewpoint. I've talked to people on the opposite side, and they say the same thing. And I can't understand why they want to be that way. That makes no sense, and they're wrong. But they also don't listen. And so we have to make sure that when we're saying we want to have a conversation, that means we're listening to one another as well as speaking. Second point I want to make to you, to really think about it. How you say something really has an impact. I often talk to people, and in my different business roles that I've had, and also in the role in ministry and everywhere else, and just as a family member and also in the community, I listen to how people say things, and they may say something in their minds that's very simple. Let's go to the store. But the way it comes out is like, let's go to the store. And so the response is very different than someone just saying, hey, let's go to the store. How you say it, the forcefulness of your words, the body language that you have accompanying your words really has an impact to the one who is receiving that message. We have to really think about that. That's why I say it's the art of communication. You got to think about those things. How am I portraying myself? Is this what I want them to really see? Will this help me to have a good conversation if I'm overly aggressive in every syllable and every word and everything in which I say? Sometimes it's not a good thing, to do. You got to make sure that you're thinking about how you're saying words and how you're speaking and the volume in which you're speaking. Is it really speaking or is it shouting? And so think about those things. Third thing is when you're having a conversation, you have to be willing to have your preconceived thoughts of the person or the topic challenged. So let me give you a great example. And I've used this. Many people who have been around me for any period of time, whether it's purely for business or ministry or anything else, have heard me talk about this story. And so I'm going to change the name or not mention the name so I don't identify anyone in particular. So years ago, I worked at a installation that was a security installation. And in it, I was, younger in my career, and I was there to help on a project. And this secure installation, of course, it had security on the borders. It had security at the front of each building. It had security in each department and everything else. And it just so happened that when I began to work on that particular engagement, there was a gentleman that was there that was an employee of that facility. And he was the one that worked with us on a day-to-day basis. Well, in our place in which we worked, you had to go through a locked door to get into the room. And the room was large enough for about 5 of us. We had desks all around and everything else, and a few computers, but the real servers were somewhere else. But, it was kind of like that. And there were no windows. All the walls were white. And it was just us. And so whatever conversations happened was us. Any kind of instructions or meetings was amongst us. And so when I first saw him and all, I smiled, greeted and everything else, myself and my colleagues. And he had just this cold, glaring look at me. And I didn't know what that was, so I brushed it off. I said, okay, let me make sure I get my work done. And this went on for months. And it didn't help that this gentleman, an older guy, but he was about 6'5", and he was probably about 230, 240. And so he was there that I worked with him on a regular basis. And I would always say, well, I'm doing what I need to do, but there definitely isn't like a warm feeling with this person. As time went on, I found out what was going on. This gentleman had been really focused on me because he and I were of different ethnicities. He and I were the only ones that were different. In other words, I was the only one that was different from everyone that was there. And so what ended up happening was he didn't want me there. I didn't know that. I just figured he was a very cold, meaning person. But I found out something that was very different. He later, I mean almost a year later, he came to me and said, James, I have to apologize. I said, oh, okay. For what? He said, well, I didn't like you from the moment you walked in because of your ethnicity. I had not grown up with folks of your ethnicity before. And I have my own thoughts about you and everybody in my family from where I came from. And I won't mention the state, but where I came from, we didn't like folks like you at all. And yes, I was giving reports behind your back, trying to get you out of here. But I realized that you weren't anything like the stereotype or the things that I've been told all my life. And I want to personally apologize to you. And I was thinking, whoa. And so I was trying to process that conversation. And so when I was processing that conversation, I realized I said to myself, James, keep your composure. Now, James, just talk with him. He's sharing with you, so listen and then talk to him calmly back and forth. And so we did. We had a conversation that day. And that was the first of many conversations. I'm stressing the word conversation. Many conversations. And without a doubt, what ended up happening, we became very good friends. He would invite me over to his house and everything else because he realized that what he had been taught was now not really true because he's now had firsthand experience. So rather than speaking and not conversating, I could have shouted back. I could have said all kinds of colorful things, but that wasn't the place for it. It was better to have a conversation. And then his perceptions were challenged and he realized, oh, that wasn't the right way to think. And so it changed his perspective for years later. Even after I left that particular engagement and did some other things, he would reach out and keep in touch with me and ask me how I was doing, what was going on. It was because of a conversation that started it all. And so we have to think about this in this turbulent world in which we live. Conversations matter. There's another point I want to make here, and that is this. You have to realize that when you have conversations, you're not always going to be on the same page or agreement with someone else. I know that's a strange thing to say, but you're not always going to agree on everything. We are not a world full of clones where everyone does the same thing all the time. And that's the beauty of what the world we live in, because we're able to see the different personalities and interact with them and all. And that's a great thing. And we have to appreciate that fact. And so in our conversations, we have to make sure that we say, okay, I understand that we may be from a different political background or ethnic background or economic background or different countries, but there's got to be something in common that we can just talk about. I found out over the years that as I've worked with many people from all over the world, I would always find something that we had in common. It was always something. It could be food, it could be sports, it could be a book, it could be anything. And so even for those folks that we had very little in common, then I would focus on the thing that we did have in common. So that way we can build respect for each other. That way we could actually work together. And so these things are our focus point. What can we do together? What can we accomplish together? And that's what we have to figure out in our art of communication. Let me rehash a little bit. Remember, when you're having a conversation, I want to make sure you realize that there's the speaking and there is also the listening. When you're able to do both, it's a beautiful thing because you begin to understand one another and you begin to understand that, oh, it's okay, we don't agree on a lot, but we can do some things together. And so that way we can make sure that we're able to build some relationships. Now, the reason why this is also important is even with this whole concept of having a conversation, there are times when something may happen and you or the person near you may need help. You've at least built a relationship, so you may know that you don't have the same faith background or you don't have the same education or whatever, but you're still people. And because you're still people, when there's a need, you can still reach over and help that person and treat them with respect. and they can do likewise to you. And so that's the beauty of living on the earth. Everybody gets to choose their positions, their thoughts, and everything else. But in the end, you have to at least respect that they're human also. And so in that, I just wanted to share that whole thought process and that conversation, or those conversations that I've had. And I'm curious to know, how have you dealt with the art of conversation? Have you been at a point that you chose that I would rather have a conversation than a shouting match? I would love to hear your thoughts in those areas. I would love to know what you figure is the right way to go, and how do you deal with folks that have differing viewpoints than you. And so these are things that are important, especially in the day and time in which we live right now, where information is communicated so quickly. So how do you make sure that you can have a conversation, which is speaking and listening? Until next time, I hope you have a great day. Share this podcast with anyone else that you know that would listen to this and it could help them. Make sure that we're able to be on the same page and that we can still communicate with each other. Make sure you remember the points I told you about, that how you communicate also matters. So as you're sharing with them, do it in a great way. Say, look, I heard a great podcast. You might want to look at this or listen to this. Okay? Until next time, I hope you have a great day.